The millionaire's son lay motionless on the cool marble, his eyes sealed shut, his young body stiff with shock. Beside him knelt Grace, the new maid, her hands trembling violently as she clutched something small, dark, and wriggling in her palm. "Grace, what have you done?" the butler gasped, his usually composed face etched with horror. He stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear he couldn't name. Heavy footsteps echoed through the opulent mansion, growing louder with each passing second. Mr. Caleb Thompson, a man whose vast fortune could procure almost anything his heart desired, burst into the room. His face, usually a mask of composed authority, was ashen with terror. "What happened to my son?" he bellowed, rushing to Ethan's side. Grace looked up at him, her lips trembling, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I didn't hurt him, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I swear, I was only trying to help." "Help!" Caleb barked, his voice resonating through the expansive hall like a thunderclap. "You touched my son? You dared to approach him without my express permission?" Slowly, almost reluctantly, Grace unfurled her palm. Inside lay something that none in that room had ever encountered before, a grotesque anomaly. It was something strangely dark, glistening with an unnatural moisture, and unsettlingly, it moved. A collective gasp filled the air as everyone recoiled, their faces paling in unison. The air hung thick and heavy, laden with unspoken dread, until a fragile sound pierced the suffocating silence. "Dad!" The sound came from the boy on the floor. Ethan, the same boy who had been born deaf, the same boy who had never uttered a single coherent word in his entire life. For a timeless moment, everyone stood transfixed, frozen in place, even Caleb. And in that instant, a chilling realization dawned upon him. The young maid, the girl he barely acknowledged, had seemingly achieved the impossible. Dear viewers, brace yourselves for an emotionally charged saga of love, unwavering faith, and a miracle of the kind that even the most extravagant wealth can never purchase. Stay with us until the very end, for the unfolding events will undoubtedly touch your heart and serve as a potent reminder that the most profound healing often comes from the most unexpected sources. The Thompson Mansion, a monument to opulence and grandeur, was a place where even silence possessed its own distinct sound, a sound of hushed reverence and stifled emotions. Every surface gleamed with meticulous care. Every chandelier sparkled like a cascade of captured sunlight. Yet, beneath the veneer of perfection, something profound was undeniably missing. The house was immense, a sprawling testament to wealth, but it harbored an emptiness that no amount of lavish decoration could ever hope to conceal. The army of servants moved with practiced stealth, gliding silently from room to room, careful to avoid even the slightest disturbance. It was said that the master of the house, Mr. Caleb Thompson, insisted upon this atmosphere of enforced tranquility. Caleb was a man consumed by the pursuit of flawlessness. His meticulously structured world revolved around rigid schedules, high-stakes meetings, and contracts valued in the millions. But behind the steely gaze and the impeccable composure resided a tormented father, a man haunted by sleepless nights and gnawing anxieties. His only son, Ethan, had been born deaf. Despite his immense wealth and access to the most advanced medical technology, no treatment, no cutting-edge procedure, no specialist, however renowned, had been able to alter Ethan's fate. Caleb had spent years crisscrossing the globe, pouring exorbitant sums into experimental treatments, and entrusting his son to countless experts who offered fleeting glimmers of hope. But each time, he returned home defeated, cloaked in the same crushing silence. Ethan was now 10 years old, a bright and inquisitive boy trapped in a world without sound. He had never experienced the gentle patter of rain, never heard the comforting timbre of his father's voice, never spoken a single word. The only sounds he knew were the visual representations of speech, the shapes formed by other people's lips as they spoke. Sometimes he would sit for hours by the window, pressing his ear against the cool glass, watching the trees sway in the breeze as if they were whispering secrets he could never decipher. The mansion staff had been instructed to communicate with Ethan using rudimentary sign language. though most made little to no effort to engage with him. Some pitied him, others openly feared him, as if his very silence carried some form of ill omen. But there was one person who looked at him differently, who saw beyond his disability and recognized the vibrant soul within. Her name was Grace. Grace was a recent addition to the household staff, a young African-American maid in her mid-20s. She had sought employment at the Thompson mansion after her mother's protracted illness had left her burdened with insurmountable hospital bills. She wore the same simple uniform each day, carefully washing it by hand each night, and always kept her hair neatly confined in a bun. Grace performed her duties with quiet diligence, never complaining, never engaging in idle gossip. But beneath her calm exterior resided a heart burdened with memories she could never fully escape. Grace had once had a younger brother named Daniel. He had tragically lost his hearing following a severe infection during their childhood. She vividly remembered the dismissive attitudes of the doctors, who turned them away simply because her family couldn't afford the exorbitant cost of treatment. She remembered the helpless despair etched on her mother's face, and the agonizing silence in which Daniel passed away, never again hearing her voice. Since then, Grace carried a silent promise within her heart, a vow that if she ever encountered another child suffering a similar fate, she would never stand idly by. The first time Grace saw Ethan, he was sitting on the grand marble staircase, meticulously arranging a line of toy cars. He didn't acknowledge her presence as she passed, but she couldn't help but notice something profoundly unsettling about him. His movements lacked the spontaneity and carefree abandon of most children. He was unnaturally still, his posture rigid, his movements overly cautious. His eyes, though bright, held a palpable sense of loneliness, a profound isolation that resonated deep within her. From that day forward, Grace began leaving small, unassuming gifts for him on the steps. A meticulously folded paper bird, a single piece of chocolate wrapped in shimmering gold foil, a small handwritten note accompanied by a simple drawing. Initially, Ethan displayed no discernible reaction. But one morning, she noticed that the chocolate was gone, and the paper bird was carefully positioned next to his toy cars. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. When Grace cleaned the towering windows near his playroom, he would position himself close by, watching her reflection in the glass. She would smile warmly and offer a gentle wave. Hesitantly, he began to wave back. Once, when she accidentally dropped a teacup, he startled and then dissolved into silent laughter, clutching his stomach with both hands. It was the first time anyone in the mansion had witnessed him smile, a genuine expression of unadulterated joy that illuminated his entire face. With each passing day, Grace became the only person Ethan genuinely trusted, the only person who seemed to see him, truly see him, not as a disabled child, but as a boy deserving of love and connection. She taught him simple hand signs, and in turn, he taught her how to find joy in the smallest of things, the subtle beauty that often went unnoticed in the chaotic rhythm of life. She didn't treat him like a patient to be pitied. She treated him like a boy who deserved to be heard, to be understood, and to be valued in his own unique way. But not everyone approved of their blossoming friendship. One evening, while Grace was meticulously wiping down the polished surface of the dining table, the stern-faced head butler approached her, his voice a sharp whisper. "You should keep your distance from him, Grace. Mr. Thompson doesn't appreciate the staff becoming too familiar with young Master Ethan." Grace looked up, startled by the butler's uncharacteristic tone. "But he seems so much happier," she said quietly, her brow furrowed with concern. "That is not your concern," the butler replied curtly, his eyes narrowed. "You are here to perform your duties, to clean, not to form emotional attachments." Grace remained silent, but her heart vehemently disagreed. She knew the insidious face of loneliness, and she saw it reflected in Ethan's eyes every time she looked at him, a silent plea for connection that she couldn't ignore. That night, while the rest of the staff retired to their quarters, Grace sat by the kitchen window, her thoughts swirling in her mind like the steam rising from her lukewarm cup of tea. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to amplify her unease. She thought of Daniel, her beloved brother, and how no one had cared enough to truly notice his pain, how he had slipped away unnoticed in the sterile silence of the hospital. She couldn't allow that to happen again. She had made a promise, a solemn vow to herself, and she intended to keep it. The next morning, she found Ethan sitting alone in the meticulously manicured garden, scratching at his ear and frowning. He seemed unusually uncomfortable, a subtle distress evident in his body language. Grace knelt beside him, her heart filled with concern, and gently signed, "Are you all right?" He shook his head, his expression troubled. She leaned closer, gently tilting his head to examine his ear. The bright sunlight illuminated the delicate folds of his ear, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Deep inside his ear canal, something dark was glistening, reflecting the light in an unnatural way. Grace blinked, unsure of what she had just witnessed. It appeared to be a small, shadowy mass, shifting subtly, but she dismissed it as a trick of the light, a figment of her overactive imagination. She didn't touch him, not wanting to alarm him, just offered a reassuring smile and said softly, "Let's tell your father, okay?" Ethan shook his head vehemently, his small hands trembling as he signed rapidly. "No doctors," he signed, his eyes wide with a fear that went beyond simple apprehension. He signed again, his movements jerky and agitated. "They hurt me." Grace froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. A flash of raw, unadulterated pain flickered in his eyes, revealing a depth of trauma that she hadn't fully comprehended before. And in that instant, she understood everything. He wasn't simply afraid of hospitals and medical procedures. He was terrified, scarred by past experiences, and deeply mistrustful of anyone in a position of authority. That night, sleep eluded her. The disturbing image of that dark, glistening object lodged deep within Ethan's ear haunted her waking thoughts. What if it was something serious, something sinister? What if it was the underlying cause of his deafness, the physical impediment that had stolen his ability to hear? She considered calling someone, but then she remembered the rigid hierarchy of the mansion, the unwavering adherence to protocol. Without Mr. Thompson's express approval, no one would listen, and Mr. Thompson barely acknowledged her existence. The next day, Ethan's unease intensified. He kept touching his ear, wincing with each touch, his small face contorted in discomfort. Grace followed him into the playroom, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't stand by and watch him suffer any longer. She whispered a silent prayer, her voice barely audible. "Lord, guide me, please. Show me the right path." When Ethan winced again, tears welling up in his eyes, Grace made a decision, a choice that would irrevocably alter the course of both their lives. She reached into her pocket and retrieved a small silver pin she used to mend her uniform, a seemingly insignificant object that would soon become a symbol of hope. She knelt beside him, her touch gentle and reassuring, and said quietly, "It's okay, Ethan. I'll help you." And at that precise moment, as her trembling hand moved closer to his ear, the heavy oak door behind her creaked open, its hinges protesting with a low groan. Someone was watching. The sound of the creaking door sent a jolt of fear through Grace. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw Mr. Caleb Thompson standing in the doorway. His tailored suit was as immaculate as always, his face composed but with a sharpness that betrayed his inner turmoil, the look of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "What are you doing?" His voice was low and controlled, but it carried a weight of authority that made Grace's blood run cold. Grace quickly stood up, instinctively concealing the small silver pin behind her back. "Sir, I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He was in pain, sir. I was just trying to help him." Caleb's gaze shifted from her to his son. Ethan remained seated on the floor, his small hand pressed against his ear, his eyes blinking rapidly. He wasn't crying, but his face clearly reflected his discomfort. "You are not a doctor," Caleb said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "If something is wrong with my son, you inform me immediately." You do not touch him. Grace lowered her head, her shoulders slumping with resignation. Yes, sir. I understand. He sighed deeply, running a weary hand across his face. I've had too many people promising to help him, Grace. All of them have failed. I can't take any more chances. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying the raw emotion he usually kept carefully concealed, but he quickly regained his composure. You can go now, he added, his tone dismissive. Grace nodded, struggling to suppress the tears that were threatening to spill from her eyes. She desperately wanted to explain what she had seen, to plead with him to trust her, but his tone made it clear that any further explanation would be unwelcome. She turned and walked away quietly, her steps slow and heavy with disappointment. When she reached the hallway, she leaned against the cool wall, feeling utterly defeated, and whispered to herself, "He doesn't know how much that boy is suffering." Hours passed, each one dragging on with agonizing slowness. The mansion gradually returned to its hushed, predictable rhythm. The maids diligently polished the antique furniture. The chef meticulously prepared the evening meal. The security guards stood motionless outside, like stoic statues guarding a hidden treasure. But inside Grace's heart, the silence was louder and more oppressive than ever before. She couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, the way he had touched his ear, the dark, glistening mass she thought she had seen inside, the palpable fear in his eyes when he had said, "No doctors." That night, she retreated to her small, sparsely furnished room behind the laundry area and sat on the edge of her narrow bed. Her worn Bible lay open beside her, though she wasn't actively reading. She simply stared blankly at the pages, her mind racing, and whispered, "Lord, what do I do? Please guide me." The old clock on the wall ticked with relentless regularity, each tick echoing the growing sense of urgency within her. She thought of her brother, Daniel, and the agonizing memory of his final day came flooding back. The way he had looked at her, trying desperately to communicate something he couldn't express. She had made a promise to him, a solemn oath, and she couldn't betray it. She couldn't stand by and watch another child suffer in silence. Grace stood up suddenly, her resolve hardening. She couldn't sleep, not with Ethan's pain weighing so heavily on her conscience. She walked back through the empty hallways, her bare feet silent against the cold marble floor. The lights were dimmed, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. The house was asleep, shrouded in an eerie stillness. Only the faint hum of the air conditioning system filled the air, a constant, monotonous drone. She stopped outside Ethan's room, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of light to spill into the hallway. Inside, the small night lamp cast a soft, comforting glow. Ethan was awake, sitting up in his bed, his hands pressed against his ear again. Grace slowly pushed the door open and walked in, her movements hesitant. "It hurts again?" she signed gently, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Grace's heart ached with compassion. She knelt beside the bed, her face etched with concern, and looked closer. "Let me see," she whispered, her voice soothing. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes filled with apprehension, then leaned forward trustingly. The light from the lamp illuminated his small ear, and again, she saw it. The same dark, glistening mass, lodged deep within his ear canal. This time she was certain. Something definitively didn't belong there. Her breath caught in her throat. "It's okay," she whispered, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "I'll be gentle, I promise." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pin, her hand trembling uncontrollably. "Just hold still, all right?" Ethan looked frightened, but he nodded trustingly, his faith in her unwavering. She took a slow, deliberate breath, attempting to steady her shaking hand, and gently moved the pin closer. Her fingers trembled so violently that she could barely hold it steady. The small, dark shape seemed to retreat deeper into his ear canal, as if it were trying to hide from her. "Please, Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Guide me. Help me to help him." Then she felt it. The tip of the pin brushed against something soft and sticky, something distinctly out of place. Carefully, she hooked the pin around it and gently pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a slight tug, something dislodged and slid out, small and wet, falling into her open palm. It was black, round, and disturbingly, slightly moving. Grace froze, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath held captive in her lungs. She didn't know what it was, but she knew instinctively that it shouldn't have been inside a child's ear. Ethan's eyes widened, reflecting a mixture of confusion and fear. He touched his ear gingerly, blinking rapidly. Then he gasped, his eyes widening further. Grace leaned forward, her heart pounding with a mixture of trepidation and hope. "Ethan, are you okay?" His hands moved to his throat, then to his mouth, which opened slightly. A small sound emerged, rough and broken, but undeniably real. Grace's whole body froze. Her lips parted in disbelief, her eyes flooding with tears. You spoke." The sound came again, slightly clearer this time, tentative but undeniable. "Grace." Her heart stopped. He had just said her name. She dropped the pin, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You can hear me?" Ethan covered his ears suddenly, flinching at the unexpected noise of the ticking clock on the wall. His eyes were filled with fear, but also with a nascent sense of wonder. Grace moved closer, tears streaming down her cheeks, her heart overflowing with joy. "It's okay," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's okay, Ethan. You're hearing for the first time." Ethan looked around the room, his face a mask of confusion and shock. He pointed to the window, where the wind was rustling the curtains. "Sound?" he asked in a shaky voice, his eyes wide with wonder. Grace nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, that's a sound, Ethan." She didn't notice the door opening again, or the stunned expression on the butler's face. The butler stood there, his eyes wide with disbelief, his body frozen in place. "What on earth?" Grace turned around, startled by his sudden appearance. "Please, don't shout," she whispered quickly, her voice pleading. "He can hear now. I don't know how, but he can hear." But the butler didn't believe her, or perhaps he simply couldn't comprehend what he was witnessing. He took a step back and shouted, his voice filled with alarm. "Mr. Thompson, come quickly. Something is happening." Ethan jumped at the loud voice, covering his ears again, whimpering softly. Grace hugged him gently, her arms wrapped protectively around him. "It's okay, Ethan. It's okay. Don't be scared." Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder with each passing second. Caleb appeared in the doorway, his face pale with alarm, his voice like a thunderclap. "What is going on here?" The butler pointed an accusing finger at Grace. "Sir." She was touching him again. "And look at the boy, he's talking." Caleb's gaze shifted from the butler to his son. Ethan was shaking, clinging to Grace, his lips moving as if he was trying to form words. Then, out of nowhere, a single word emerged, clear and distinct. "Dad." The room went completely still, as if time itself had ceased to exist. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. His body froze, his mind struggling to process the impossible. For years, he had dreamed of hearing that one word, longed for the moment when his son would finally speak to him. And now it had happened, seemingly against all odds. Grace looked at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a mixture of joy and trepidation. "He can hear, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He really can." Caleb couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even blink. The butler stood speechless, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with disbelief. Even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking, as if the entire universe was holding its breath. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice weak and shaky, but undeniably real. "Dad, don't be mad." Caleb's legs gave way slightly, his body trembling uncontrollably. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. He whispered to himself, his voice filled with awe, "That's my boy's voice." But the initial shock quickly morphed into a surge of anger, fueled by years of frustration and unanswered questions. His voice rose, laced with suspicion. "What did you do to him? What did you put in his ear?" Grace shook her head, terrified by his accusatory tone. "I didn't hurt him, sir. I only pulled out something that was inside." "Something?" Caleb shouted, his face contorted with rage. "You could have killed him." Before Grace could respond, the sound of running feet filled the hallway. Security guards rushed into the room, surrounding her, their faces grim. "Sir, please," Grace cried, her voice pleading. "Listen to me. He can hear now. That's all that matters." But Caleb's voice was cold, devoid of any compassion. "Take her away. She's a danger to my son." As the guards grabbed her arms, Ethan screamed, his voice filled with panic and desperation. "No! Don't hurt her!" It was the loudest and clearest word he had ever uttered, the culmination of a lifetime of silence. And the last thing Grace heard as she was dragged away was the boy crying her name, his voice filled with a raw, heartbreaking grief that would haunt her for years to come. Grace sat in the stark security room, her hands cuffed together, the remnants of her tears drying on her face. The guards stood impassively near the door, their faces expressionless, waiting for further orders. From the hallway, she could still faintly hear Ethan's cries, his voice filled with anguish. Every time he shouted her name, her heart broke a little more, each syllable a sharp, agonizing stab of guilt and despair. She whispered a desperate prayer, her voice barely audible. "God, please let them see that I didn't hurt him. Please let them understand that I was only trying to help." Upstairs, the mansion was in a state of utter chaos. Caleb paced back and forth in the living room, his mind racing, his thoughts swirling in a maelstrom of confusion and disbelief. His son had spoken, had uttered his first word. He had heard his voice, the voice he had longed to hear for a decade. It was impossible, a blatant defiance of everything he had been told, everything he had come to believe. For 10 long years, every doctor, every specialist, every medical expert had unequivocally stated that it would never happen, that Ethan's deafness was irreversible. And yet, a simple maid, a young woman with no medical training, had accomplished the impossible in a matter of minutes. The butler, attempting to maintain a semblance of order, approached him cautiously, his voice a soft murmur. "Sir, perhaps we should call the hospital. The boy might be in danger. We don't know what that woman did to him." Caleb nodded quickly, seizing upon the suggestion as a means of regaining control. "Yes, call them now. Tell them to send an ambulance immediately. I want every specialist on call, ready to examine him." Within minutes, the grounds of the mansion were illuminated by the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Paramedics rushed inside and gently placed Ethan on a stretcher, preparing to transport him to the hospital. The boy, his eyes wide with fear and confusion, kept trying to speak, his small voice trembling with each word. "Dad, Grace helped me." But Caleb couldn't even bring himself to look at Grace, couldn't bear to acknowledge the gratitude in his son's eyes. He followed the stretcher outside, his heart torn between a desperate hope and a gnawing fear, a constant battle between the possibility of a miracle and the potential for irreparable harm. He didn't know whether what had happened was a genuine act of divine intervention or a catastrophic mistake, a well-intentioned act with devastating consequences. At the hospital, the air was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and the palpable tension of unspoken worry. Machines beeped and whirred softly, creating a constant, unnerving cacophony. Doctors in pristine white coats rushed around, their faces etched with concern. Caleb stood anxiously behind the glass wall of the examination room, watching as a team of specialists examined his son. His hands trembled slightly, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, a feeling of vulnerability that he found deeply unsettling. He had faced down ruthless investors, negotiated with powerful politicians, and commanded the attention of world leaders. But now, standing helpless in front of his own son, he felt utterly powerless, his vast wealth and influence rendered meaningless. One of the doctors, a man with tired eyes and a weary demeanor, came out of the examination room and addressed Caleb cautiously, his voice measured. "Mr. Thompson, we've run some preliminary tests. It appears that your son's hearing has been restored. Temporarily, at least." Caleb blinked, his mind struggling to process the information. "Temporarily?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "What does that mean?" The doctor adjusted his glasses nervously, avoiding eye contact. "We're not entirely certain yet. We've detected signs of irritation in his ear canal, as well as the presence of some kind of foreign substance. We'll need to conduct further tests to determine the exact nature of the substance and the extent of the damage." "Foreign substance?" Caleb repeated, his chest tightening with a growing sense of dread. "What kind of substance?" The doctor hesitated, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "Something biological. We've never encountered anything quite like it before. It appears to have been present for years." Caleb turned pale, his face ashen. "Years?" he exclaimed, his voice rising with incredulity. "Are you telling me that all the specialists who have treated my son over the years, all the renowned experts I've consulted, never noticed something lodged inside his ear?" The doctor avoided his eyes, his silence an unspoken admission of guilt. "These things can be complicated," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Caleb's voice rose, his anger barely contained, but he managed to keep it low enough not to alarm Ethan. "Complicated? I've paid you people millions, poured vast sums into research and treatment. Every year, I've flown him across the globe, seeking out the best possible care. You've scanned every inch of his body, subjected him to countless tests, and yet you missed something sitting right inside his ear?" The doctor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, and said quietly, "Mr. Thompson, perhaps you should sit down. There's something else we need to discuss." He opened a manila folder and slid it across the polished table, his movements deliberate and hesitant. Caleb frowned and looked down at the open folder. Inside were a series of medical reports, meticulously typed and signed, each one bearing official stamps and seals of approval. He began reading, his eyes scanning the pages with increasing speed, his brow furrowed with confusion and mounting suspicion. Then he stopped abruptly, his breath catching in his throat. At the bottom of one of the reports were a series of printed words that sent a cold wave of nausea washing over him, a chilling realization that made his stomach twist with a sickening dread. "Maintain diagnosis for continued funding approval. Thompson account remains active." Caleb's mouth went dry. He read the sentence again, just to be absolutely certain that he hadn't misread it, that his mind wasn't playing cruel tricks on him. But the words remained stark and undeniable, confirming his worst fears. They had been lying. All of them. His son had never been receiving genuine treatment. They had deliberately perpetuated the myth of his incurable deafness in order to ensure a continued stream of funding, to keep the money rolling in. He slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing through the sterile silence of the waiting room. His whole body was shaking, his hands trembling uncontrollably. You monsters," he whispered, his voice barely audible, laced with a mixture of rage and profound grief. "You sold my son's pain for profit. You turned his suffering into a commodity." The doctor looked down, his face flushed with shame, his voice a mere mumble. "Sir, I had no prior knowledge of that. The hospital board handles those accounts, I assure you." Caleb didn't even hear him anymore. He turned and walked straight out of the office, his head spinning, his mind reeling from the shocking revelation. Every step felt heavy, as if the weight of his guilt was pressing down on his shoulders, threatening to crush him. He had trusted them blindly and implicitly. He had believed every promise, every carefully crafted lie, because it was easier than facing the devastating truth, easier than acknowledging his own helplessness. At the end of the hallway, he saw Ethan sitting up in the hospital bed, his face pale but alert. The boy was smiling weakly, his eyes shining with an unfamiliar light, a bandage near his ear a stark reminder of the ordeal he had endured. He looked so small and fragile, yet so alive, so full of untapped potential. Caleb's chest tightened, his heart aching with a mixture of remorse and overwhelming love. For the first time, his son looked at him and actually heard him breathe, heard the unspoken emotions that he had always struggled to express. "Dad?" Ethan said quietly, his voice shaky but undeniably real. Caleb froze, unable to speak, unable to even respond to his son's voice. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision, threatening to spill down his cheeks. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried, the last time he had allowed himself to feel such raw, unadulterated emotion. He walked closer to the bed, his movements hesitant, and sat down gently beside his son. His hands trembled as he reached out and touched Ethan's face, stroking his cheek with a tenderness he hadn't displayed in years. "You can really hear me?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Ethan nodded and smiled, his eyes shining with a newfound joy. "Yes, Dad, I can hear you." Then, his smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Where's Grace?" The question hit Caleb harder than any physical blow, cutting through his anger and confusion, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. He looked away, unable to meet his son's innocent gaze. "She's not here, Ethan," he said, his voice barely audible. "Bring her here, Dad," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with a quiet but unwavering conviction. "She helped me. She's not bad. She's my friend." Caleb's throat tightened, his chest constricting with a fresh wave of guilt. For a long moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to explain his actions, couldn't justify the injustice he had inflicted upon Grace. Finally, he stood up, his movements deliberate and resolute, and turned to the nurse standing at the door. "Tell the guards to release the maid," he said, his voice clear and firm. "Bring her here to this room." Immediately, minutes later, the door opened again, and Grace walked in, her shoulders slumped with fatigue. Her uniform was wrinkled and disheveled, her face pale but remarkably calm, a mask of quiet dignity concealing the turmoil within. She looked like someone who had cried too many tears, someone who had been pushed to the very brink, but still managed to retain a glimmer of hope. Ethan's face lit up when he saw her, his eyes widening with relief and joy. "Grace!" he exclaimed, his voice weak but filled with genuine affection. Grace covered her mouth with her hand, gasping with disbelief. "You can still speak?" she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. He nodded, laughing softly, the sound like music to her ears. "Yes, Grace, you helped me. You made me hear." Caleb stood silently, watching them, observing the genuine connection that existed between his son and this remarkable young woman. Something inside him cracked open, releasing a torrent of pent-up emotions that he had suppressed for years. All the pride, the anger, the disbelief, it all began to fade away, replaced by a profound sense of shame and overwhelming guilt. He looked at Grace, his gaze softening, and spoke quietly, his voice filled with remorse. "How did you know, Grace? How did you even think to look inside his ear? What made you believe that you could help him when so many others had failed?" Grace hesitated, her eyes downcast, her voice low and humble. "I noticed him touching it every day, sir. He was always in pain. I just thought that maybe there was something small stuck there, something that was causing him discomfort. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't just stand by and watch him suffer anymore." Caleb's eyes softened, his gaze filled with gratitude. "And you pulled that thing out, whatever it was?" She nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes, sir. I don't know what it was. It moved like it was alive. It looked like it had been there for a long time." Caleb turned towards the doctor again, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. "All these years, and not one of you bothered to check properly. Not one of you truly cared. Not once." The doctor looked utterly defeated, his shoulders slumped with resignation. "I'm deeply sorry, Mr. Thompson. This should never have happened." Caleb exhaled deeply, his eyes still wet with unshed tears. He looked back at Grace, standing there quietly, her presence a silent rebuke to his own failings. "You saw what none of them did," he said softly, his voice filled with a newfound respect. Because you actually looked. Because you actually cared. Grace didn't answer, simply lowered her head. Her humility a stark contrast to the arrogance of the medical professionals who had betrayed his trust. I didn't do it for thanks, sir, she said quietly. I did it because I couldn't let him suffer. Because I believe that every child deserves to be heard, to be loved, and to have a chance at a better life. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat constricting with emotion. His voice cracked as he said, I thought money could fix everything. I thought I could buy my son's happiness, his health, his future. I was wrong. Terribly, tragically wrong. The room went silent, filled with a heavy, unspoken understanding. For a moment, all that could be heard was the faint hum of the medical machines beside Ethan's bed, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the power of human connection. Finally, Caleb spoke again, his tone calmer, more subdued. Grace, I owe you an apology. Profound and heartfelt apology. I should have listened to you. I should have trusted my instincts. But I was blinded by fear, consumed by my own desperation to protect my son. Grace shook her head, her voice filled with forgiveness. You're a father, Mr. Thompson. You were scared to lose him. I understand. Caleb's eyes glistened again, his heart overflowing with gratitude. He nodded slowly, looking at her with something new in his expression, a genuine respect that transcended social boundaries. As the night grew quiet, he sat beside his son, holding his small hand. Ethan leaned against him, sleepy but smiling, his eyes filled with a newfound sense of peace. Grace stood near the door, watching them, her heart filled with a quiet satisfaction. For the first time in a long time there was genuine peace in the room, not they. Grace's voice barely registered above a whisper. Caleb gave a slow, measured nod. I've dedicated my life to building companies, systems, hospitals, programs. I genuinely believed I was making a difference, helping people. But I see it now. The world I helped construct only understands the language of money. Grace met his gaze, her eyes holding a quiet strength. Then change it, she stated, her voice firm despite its softness. You have the power to do that. He turned, really seeing her for the first time. His eyes, previously clouded with disillusionment, now flickered with a nascent sense of purpose. You're right. I will. A few hours later, the hospital conference room buzzed with anticipation. Reporters jostled for position. Cameras flashed incessantly. Microphones were thrust forward like eager mouths waiting to be fed. No one had any inkling why Caleb Thompson, the notoriously private billionaire, had suddenly summoned the media. Caleb strode to the podium, his expression a mask of calm resolve. Grace stood at the back of the room, a silent observer, her heart pounding in her chest. He began to speak, his voice resonating with a newfound conviction, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning. For 10 years, I was told my son would never hear. I spared no expense, hiring the best doctors, utilizing the most advanced technology, buying into every promise money could secure. And I believed them implicitly. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. But last night, a simple act of kindness by a maid in my home achieved what countless experts could not. She gave my son back his hearing. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. The clicking of camera shutters intensified. He continued, his voice hardening with barely suppressed anger. What we discovered afterward is more insidious than I could have ever imagined. My son's condition wasn't a matter of fate or unavoidable circumstance. It was a calculated profit margin. He was deliberately kept sick so that certain individuals could continue to line their pockets. The room fell into stunned silence. The enormity of his accusation hung in the air, palpable and suffocating. Caleb lifted a thick folder, its contents filled with damning medical records. These are the documents that substantiate my claims, signed by individuals who swore an oath to heal, yet chose avarice instead. This is the inevitable consequence when compassion is sacrificed at the altar of greed. He paused, his gaze dropping for a moment before he lifted his head, his eyes blazing with righteous indignation. I was complicit in that world. I was blinded by ambition and ignored what truly mattered. But that ends today. I am announcing the establishment of a new foundation, dedicated to providing free, comprehensive medical care for every child with hearing impairments, irrespective of their background or ability to pay. A scattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing in volume. Some reporters discreetly dabbed at their eyes. Caleb's voice softened, infused with genuine emotion. And the first person I'm entrusting to lead this mission is Grace. Every head in the room swiveled, all eyes converging on Grace. She froze, her hand flying to her mouth in astonishment. Caleb offered her a gentle, reassuring smile. She taught me the true meaning of listening, not with money, but with the heart. After the press conference, as the room emptied, Caleb found Grace standing near the hospital entrance. The air was crisp and cool, the sun bright but gentle on her face. She still looked utterly bewildered. "Sir, you don't need to give me anything," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "I was only doing what was right." Caleb shook his head, his expression earnest. "You didn't just help my son, Grace. You opened my eyes. You reminded me that people matter infinitely more than power or prestige." A faint smile touched her lips. "I'm just glad Ethan is okay. That's all I ever wanted." Caleb's expression softened even further. "He keeps asking for you, you know. He won't stop saying your name." Her smile deepened, tears welling in her eyes. "He's a brave boy." When they returned to Ethan's room, he was sitting up in bed, engrossed in playing with a small toy car. He looked up as they entered and his face lit up with a wide grin. "Grace," he called out, his voice still a little hesitant but full of joy. Grace's heart melted. She rushed to his side and enveloped him in a gentle hug. "I missed you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan giggled softly. "You sound happy," he observed. Grace smiled through her tears. "That's because I am." Caleb watched them quietly, a profound sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in his life, he witnessed genuine love, pure, simple, and unadulterated. It wasn't the love that demanded grand gestures or extravagant displays. It was the love that simply endured, that stayed present, offering comfort and unwavering support. In the days that followed, the mansion underwent a transformation. The oppressive atmosphere that had once permeated its halls was replaced by the sounds of laughter and light-hearted chatter. Ethan, his little feet now a blur, explored every nook and cranny. He still spoke slowly, deliberately, savoring each carefully articulated word, but every sound was a precious melody. Grace returned to work, but her role had changed dramatically. Caleb welcomed her as a member of his household, someone to be trusted, someone who was now considered family. Each evening, they gathered in the garden, Caleb poring over reports for his new foundation, Grace patiently teaching Ethan new words, and Ethan erupting in peals of laughter at the sounds he could now hear so clearly. Sometimes Caleb would simply observe them, these two remarkable individuals who had irrevocably altered the course of his life. In those moments, he experienced a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in decades. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Ethan looked up from his drawing and asked, "Dad, can I say something?" Caleb smiled warmly. "Of course, son." Ethan pointed to Grace and said, slowly and deliberately, "She's my hero." Grace covered her face, overwhelmed by emotion. Caleb looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and affection. "She's mine too," he said softly. Later that night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Caleb stood by the window of his study, gazing out at the tranquil garden. The fountain, its waters shimmering under the moonlight, once served as a constant reminder of silence. But tonight its sound was different. He could hear the gentle rush of water, a steady and vibrant melody, a constant reminder that his world was no longer defined by silence. Grace quietly appeared in the doorway. "Still awake?" she inquired. Caleb nodded, a gentle smile gracing his lips. "Just thinking about how sometimes the smallest voice can change everything." Grace returned his smile. That's true. They stood there in companionable silence for a moment. The kind of silence that needed no words. A silence filled with understanding and shared gratitude. When Caleb finally turned to her, his eyes were soft with sincerity. Thank you, Grace. You didn't just give my son his hearing back. You gave me mine. She lowered her gaze humbly. Sometimes we all just need someone to listen. Caleb nodded, his voice thick with emotion. And this time I will. Outside, the fountain continued to flow, its gentle sounds a testament to life and hope. Inside, laughter echoed faintly from Ethan's room, a sound that would never again be taken for granted. For the first time, the Thompson mansion wasn't just a house. It was a home, filled with the comforting and life-affirming sound of love. Dear viewers, sometimes in life, silence doesn't originate from our ears, comes from our hearts. We become so preoccupied with chasing success, pursuing comfort, that we cease to hear the voices of those who truly need us. Mr. Thompson possessed all the wealth in the world. Yet, it took a maid, armed with nothing but kindness and compassion, to open his ears and touch his soul. She didn't heal his son with sophisticated science or miraculous magic. She did it with love, with unwavering attention, with a heart that refused to ignore pain. Grace didn't just restore a boy's hearing. She taught a father how to truly listen. And that, my friends, is the greatest miracle of all. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or forgotten, remember this story. Because somewhere, someone like Grace still exists. Someone who listens when the rest of the world remains silent. And sometimes, that's all it takes to restore hope, to reignite life, and to remind us what it truly means to love. If this story has touched your heart, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what lesson you learned from Grace's story today. Your comment might inspire someone else to listen with their heart, too.